The protagonist of today's story discovered ancient tombs, explored secret passages inside pyramids, and recovered artifacts as old as time itself. And he did all of this while also getting into fistfights, foiling assassination attempts with his trusty whip, dodging bullets amongst Egyptian ruins, and facing the opposition of a French rival. Now at this point, it might sound rather familiar to you, but no, we're not talking about Indiana Jones. We don't do fictional characters here on Biographics. Well, we sometimes do, but we're pretty sly about it. No, today's video is about Giovanni Battista Belzoni, the Italian circus strongman, adventurer, explorer, tomb raider, early archaeologist, and the father of modern Egyptology. Giovanni Battista Belzoni was born Giovanni Battista Bolzone on the 5th of November 1778 in Padua, northern Italy, back then a part of the independent Republic of Venice. All we know of his family is that his father was a barber and that he shared a home with 13 siblings. He displayed signs of rebellion and lust for adventure at a very early age. He was 13 when he rebelled against his father's wishes that he apprenticed as a barber, and he ran away from home, dragging with him his younger brother of just 9. What was their objective? Well, that was to reach Rome, the Eternal City. After days of endless walking, they finally got there. Or so they thought. They were actually in Bologna, 400 kilometers north of Rome. Definitely not a bad start for someone who would become famous for being an explorer. Giovanni, or Giobatta as his brother used to call him, he did not surrender. 3 years later, with the help of an aristocratic friend, he finally made it to Rome. Yes, at last, and then his dreams came true because he became a barber. I mean, there's nothing wrong with barbers, don't get me wrong, I don't mean any disrespect, but it's not exactly what he wanted to do. In fact, that's kind of why he left in the first place. So Giobatta, at this point, had started to show an interest in the new science of hydraulic engineering, but he did not have the occasion to put this into practice yet. Then, at the age of 18, his girlfriend, she dumped him. His totally rational and measured reaction to this was to take religious vows and become a Capuchin friar. It was with the monks that he first put into practice his love of hydraulics by building wells and irrigation systems for the convent. Giobatta had a restless soul, and he soon had outgrown the convent life, quite literally. He had become a giant of 6'7", or about 2 meters, and he was almost as wide and as strong as an ox. This was just not really very credible as a contemplative monk. But good news is, history came to the rescue because Napoleon entered Rome in 1798 and dissolved all religious orders. Giobatta had the chance to join the French army, but he sided with the Prussians instead. Whilst traveling Europe with the Prussian army, Giobatta realized that he was very popular at country fairs because of his size and people they were willing to pay to see him. He also had perfected his hydraulic skills, creating small shows with musical fountains and magic lanterns. At some point in the early 1800s, he had left the army and he made his way to the Netherlands, and he funded his travels with his shows. It was after one of these shows that he had a slight misunderstanding with some French soldiers. The details are not known, except that Giobatta the Giant apparently battered the soldiers. That meant he had to flee to the only place in Europe where Napoleon's armies couldn't reach him, and that was, of course, Great Britain. The first thing Giobatta did was change his surname from Bolzone to Belzoni. You see, this lad, he also had brains. The surname Bolzone sounded suspiciously Spanish to untrained English ears, and Spain was an ally of Napoleon at the time. Then he had to ensure a livelihood for himself and for his newly wedded bride, Sarah. His engineering skills were not appreciated, so Giobatta put into place Plan B. In 1803, he became a circus strongman with the name of the Patagonian Samson. He later became known as the Roman Hercules. The highlight of his show was the human pyramid. During this act, Belzoni would walk around the stage carrying 12 grown men on his back. Then Sarah would climb up onto the top of the pyramid, waving a crimson flag. Other acts included juggling flags while carrying 7 men or lifting a cannon by its muzzle. The show also included a performance of musical glasses and a magic lantern display, proving that this giant had more intellectual ambitions than it transpired. Belzoni became very popular, and he and Sarah started touring circuses and theatres all across Europe, from Edinburgh to Madrid, from Lisbon to Naples. It was during one of these travels that his life was going to change direction once again. In February of 1815, Belzoni and his wife, they were sailing back from Naples when their ship was forced to dock in Malta. Napoleon had just fled from his exile in Elba, and the British Navy in the Mediterranean was inspecting all suspicious vessels. It was in Malta that Belzoni met by total chance one Mr. Baghos, an envoy of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Viceroy of Egypt. Muhammad Ali was one of those characters who treat life like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Of Albanian origin, he traveled to Egypt in 1801 to fight against Napoleon with his band of mercenaries. He had quickly risen through the ranks, becoming Viceroy in Cairo, formerly subordinate to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, but in fact the true ruler of the country, doing as he pleased, including keeping a vast harem of wives and concubines and siring 95 children. In addition to single-handedly contributing to the demographic growth of Egypt, the Pasha was also concerned with growing its economy. He had undertaken a vast modernization program of Egypt's agriculture, focusing on cash crops like cotton and tobacco that required complex irrigation systems. So, as you might imagine, hydraulic experts were somewhat in high demand. Belzoni was at this time a successful showman, but the lure of his first love, hydraulics, it was irresistible. He jumped to the occasion and sold his services to Baghos, claiming that he had designed an irrigation wheel 6 times as efficient as the ones currently in use. In the spring of 1815, Belzoni, his wife Sarah, and a young Irish assistant called James Curtin, they landed in Cairo. Cairo, and all of Egypt at that time, was a dangerous place. Even if the Pasha welcomed Europeans, they were not seen favorably by the majority of the population, and that included the ruling elite. They were suspicious, and rightly so, of their colonial ambitions. So 2 nations were particularly active in the Egyptian theatre: Great Britain and France. Their aim? Well, that was to extend their influence over the Pasha and the country's economy. But most of all, it was to raid as many ancient Egyptian artifacts as possible to meet the demands of museums and private collectors back home. The Pasha welcomed Belzoni with open arms, but the giant found out that his wheel was not intended to raise the waters of the mighty Nile to irrigate the desert. Its aim was simply to feed the fountains adorning the Viceroy's harem. The wheel, it did work 6 times better as promised, but during its inauguration, a prank by some of the courtiers resulted in it almost crushing Belzoni's assistant, James Curtin. It was almost the final curtain for Curtin when the Italian leapt into the canal, and thanks to his enormous strength, he stopped the wheel just in time. The wheel, unfortunately, it broke down, marking the end of Belzoni's hydraulic career in Egypt. So, well, what now? Muhammad Ali took pity on Belzoni and his wife and introduced them to the British consul, Sir Henry Salt. Salt had been tasked by the Crown to collect statues, sarcophagi, and other pieces to replenish the Egyptian collection at the British Museum, which at that time was lagging behind that of their mortal rivals, the Louvre Museum in Paris. Salt's counterpart in the French camp was Consul Bernardino Drovetti. Born in Turin in northern Italy, Drovetti had fought alongside Napoleon against the hated Austrians. His military prowess had earned him a French citizenship and given him a taste for the use of explosives, muskets, and the services of cutthroats. Now, I should clarify at this point that neither of these guys nor their employees were archaeologists, let alone Egyptologists. These were just glorified tomb raiders and art thieves with little respect or knowledge of the culture that they were plundering. Henry Salt was looking for a strong and a resolute man who could succeed where Drovetti had failed. He wanted someone to collect a giant bust of the pharaoh Ramesses II from the ruins of ancient Thebes in southern Egypt. He then wanted that loaded onto a boat on the Nile and transported to Cairo. The French consuls had even drilled a hole into the king's head, loaded it with explosives, and tried to blow it apart into 2 pieces so that it was easier to carry. It didn't work, and the statue, it remained intact. Soult gave Belzoni a very detailed set of instructions for his recovery mission. The last of these instructions was, "Don't drop it in the Nile." Belzoni could not wait to face this stone giant, and he left for Thebes immediately. He soon realized that the only way to shift the 9-foot-tall, 7-ton heavy statue across 5 miles of sands was to use the same technology used by the ancient Egyptians: a wooden sled, ropes, and cheap labor. Now, it was a known tactic employed by Trivedi that he would send his agents to stir dissent among the locals to hinder his rivals' efforts. This may explain why, during the first days of the Thebes expedition, some of Belzoni's hired workers they turned against him. The leaders of the rebels attacked him with a dagger. The Italian giant, he coolly disarmed them, knocked them out cold, and lifted them by their ankles and swung them around in order to inflict blows on the other attackers. Now, it's important we point out here that we at Biographics, we don't endorse this as a method of resolving trade disputes, but we have to admit that as far as self-defense goes, pretty badass. The rebellion, it was quelled, and after 3 weeks of hard work, Ramesses II's gigantic head was sailing downriver towards Cairo. It did not drop in the Nile, and escorted by the great Belzoni, the bust made it all the way back to England. Ramesses II's head, it still sits today at the British Museum. In the summer of 1817, Belzoni was back in Egypt, now heading for his second expedition to unearth the legendary temple of Abu Simbel. The colossal structure at the time was almost completely buried in sand, with just one head poking out of the sand. Belzoni was escorted by 2 British Navy officers, James Irby and Charles Mangle. These 2 were not really interested in ancient Egyptian architecture. They had joined with the hope of doing what every British gentleman of that time was expected to do: get into a firefight with the French. The party did not have to face Trivedi, though, but rather a giant dune covering the temple's entrance. After 6 weeks of constant digging under the fierce summer sun, on the 1st of August, 1817, the 3 Europeans and the local laborers finally entered one of the grandest temples of ancient times, the first humans to do so in more than 3,000 years. Belzoni found out that there were no jewels, mummies, or statues to be seized, but he did not leave completely empty-handed. He drafted a detailed map of the temple, noting all measurements and proportions of note. This is the detail that set him apart from other grave robbers. He had a desire to acquire knowledge and understand the art and architecture of the ancient Egyptian civilization. But he also had to make a living, so he returned to Thebes to look for more statues on behalf of Soult and the British Museum. When he got there, he was met by a bad surprise. The site had been taken over by a party of French diggers. Belzoni was well known to them, and he knew he'd better avoid them. But he was spotted. Trivedi's men had firearms, and so he was forced to flee. During the chase through the ruins of Thebes, one of the French fired his pistol, narrowly missing the giant man. The Italian wrote to Consul Henry Soult in Cairo. Things, they were getting dangerous for him, and as an agent of His Majesty's consular services, he had every right to demand armed protection. The Thebes chase was not the only instance in which Belzoni had reason to fear for his life. Once, in the port of Alexandria, he had been approached by Trivedi's interpreter, a fellow Italian who had told him in clear terms, "If I see you around one of our sites, I'll slit your throat." In another occasion, Belzoni was riding through the streets of Cairo when he was aggressively confronted by an Egyptian officer demanding passage through an alley. The officer did not wait for an answer and delivered a blow to Belzoni's stomach. The giant, he simply did not flinch. Not being accustomed to put up with such situations, I returned the compliment and struck him with my whip across his shoulders. The officer then took his pistol and shot at Belzoni, but the Italian dodged the bullet, and it went on to hit another soldier who was approaching him from behind. During a later exploration to the oasis of Al-Qasar, his 2 local guides tried to kill Belzoni in his sleep. Once again, he was quick to react and strangled the 2 assassins in self-defense. And it's at this point that we have to wonder, did these people really see no risk in attacking a 6'7" strongman? I mean, there are risks involved with such an endeavor. But anyway, Belzoni, he didn't always have the upper hand. In yet another mission, he had collected a monumental obelisk from the island of Philar on the Nile near Aswan. But all of his hard work was to be in vain, as Trivedi's men seized the obelisk by holding the giant at gunpoint. And now let's go back to Belzoni's message to Soult in August of 1817. This is when Soult laid out his cards. In reply, he specified that Belzoni had not been employed officially by the British government or the British Museum. Soult considered him to be his own private employee, little more than a mercenary. This made a big difference. It made Belzoni disposable, and his findings were private property in Soult's hands. The Italian was not happy, but he continued his travels away from the dangers of Thebes. His next target, well, that was the legendary Valley of the Kings, where he made some initial interesting discoveries. However, at this time, hieroglyphs had not yet been deciphered, so in fact he didn't really have any idea what he had discovered. As an example, he once stumbled into the tomb of King I, but only noted a wall painting of 12 baboons. Therefore, he called it the Tomb of the 12 Monkeys. Now, grace of movement, as you might imagine, was definitely not his forte. By his own confession, when needing a rest inside the same tomb, I sought a resting place and contrived to sit, but when my weight bore on the body of an Egyptian, it crushed it like a bandbox. I sunk among the broken mummies with a crash of bones, rags, and wooden cases. Every step I took, I crushed a mummy in some part or other. So yes, in just a few moments he essentially destroyed a museum's worth of content. As another example, another time the Italian came across an ancient wall and ordered his workmen to open a passage using a sophisticated scientific instrument, a battering ram. His experience in the Valley of the Kings was not all slapstick, however. Following hints from local legends, on the 6th of October 1817 he made his greatest discovery so far: the entrance to the tomb of Seti I, a richly decorated, sprawling burial site the size of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The monument is still also known as Belzoni's tomb and was described as the Sistine Chapel of ancient Egypt. When news reached Cairo, Henry Soult organized a tour of the site with a group of British aristocrats who looked down on Belzoni as a simple hired hand. This was the end of the collaboration between the two men. Belzoni realized that Soult had been taking credit for his achievements with the British establishment. Not only that, the consul had failed to ship many of Belzoni's specimens to the British Museum and had been selling them at private auctions instead. The Italian rescinded his contract with Soult and continued working on his own, adding another string of explorations under his belt. And then on the 2nd of March, 1818, was his last great achievement. Having visited the pyramids at Giza, Belzoni became fascinated with the pyramid of Khafre. This was the second largest pyramid, and it was generally recognized as being inaccessible. Following a hunch, the Italian found a secret entrance on the north side of the building, and crawling inside it, he came across a burial chamber and toured its subterranean section. To avoid having his discovery appropriated by Giovanni or Soult, he quickly scrawled on a wall, "Discovered by G. Belzoni, 2nd of March, 1818. But in Italian it was like this. By 1820, after 5 years of adventures, Belzoni and Sarah were back in London. Being a showman to the core, the giant organized a spectacular live dissection of a mummy for the Royal College of Surgeons and an exhibition of Egyptian antiquities in Piccadilly. Both were very popular. His main endeavor was to set the record straight with Soult and claim the credit that was due for his discoveries. He wrote an account of his adventure entitled Narratives of the Operations and Recent Discoveries within the Pyramids, Temples, Tombs, and Excavations in Egypt and Nubia, and of a journey to the coast of the Red Sea in search of the ancient Berenice, and another to the oasis of Jupiter Ammon by Giovanni Battista Belzoni, in 2 volumes. We're going to assume that the first one there is the title, the enormously long title. The book, it had some success. However, it seems that Soult eventually won this duel of fame. Until recently, most of Belzoni's recovered artifacts at the British Museum were still known as the Soult Collection. In the spring of 1823, Belzoni left London for another adventure. This time he was in search of the source of the River Niger in West Africa and of the lost city of Timbuktu in modern-day Mali. The Italian was forced to take a long detour via sea because of a local war raging in southern Morocco, and so in November of 1823 he landed in Benin with a British merchant, John Huston. It was here that Belzoni met his ultimate foe. Ironically, for such a giant, it was a tiny creature that would succeed where cutthroats and French bullets had failed. Belzoni contracted dysentery, a bacterial infection of the bowels highly prevalent in tropical areas, which in severe cases may cause death by dehydration. And this was one of those cases. Feeling death creeping in, the once mighty Roman Hercules entrusted an amethyst to his companion for it to be given to his wife. On the 3rd of December 1823, Giovanni Battista Belzoni died and was buried under a tree in Guazzo, Benin. Belzoni is considered by part of the archaeological community as a thief and an ignorant vandal. Others, though, they celebrate him as an adventurous character who laid the foundations for modern Egyptology. Many even see him as a source of inspiration, even as a certain inspiration, perhaps, for a raider of the Lost Ark, at least according to some film critics. We know where we stand on that one, but we'd love to hear your views on the protagonist of today's video. Please do leave your comments below, and as always, like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.